Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix Chapter 15. The Hogwarts High Inquisitor. They carefully went through the copies of the Daily Prophet that Hermione subscribed to, hoping to find something about what Percy had mentioned in his letter. However, before they could wipe the owl droppings off the top of the milk jug, Hermione gasped and flattened the newspaper on the table, revealing a photo of Dolores Umbridge. At that moment, Umbridge was smiling and winking at them from under the large headline, **** Government Explores Educational Reforms. Dolores Umbridge appointed as first Senior Undersecretary. Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary. Harry's face darkened, and the piece of toast he was holding slipped from his fingers. What does that mean? Hermione read aloud, a surprising development. Last night, the Ministry of Magic passed new legislation aimed at strengthening management in magical education at Hogwarts School. In recent times, the minister has become increasingly concerned about changes occurring at Hogwarts, said young assistant to the minister, Percy Weasley. Many parents are unhappy with these changes at the school. The minister has begun to respond to this situation by introducing new laws to influence improvements in the magical school. This isn't the first time such measures have been taken. The Educational Decree No. 22, passed on August 30, was designed to ensure that if the current headmaster could not find a suitable candidate, the minister would personally select someone appropriate to fill the position. That's why Dolores Umbridge could be appointed as a staff member at Hogwarts, continued Weasley. Dumbledore couldn't find a suitable person, so the minister appointed Umbridge, and of course, she's doing a fantastic job. She's what? Harry shouted. Don't interrupt, there's more, Hermione said sternly. Fantastic job overall. In addition to teaching defense against the dark arts, she also provides the minister with first-hand information about what's happening at Hogwarts. This is the latest function obtained under Educational Decree No. 23, creating a new position, Hogwarts Senior Undersecretary. This marks an exciting new phase in the minister's plan to correct the areas in Hogwarts where people feel standards are slipping, continued Weasley. The Undersecretary will have the authority to inspect her fellow teachers to ensure they meet standards. Professor Umbridge seems well suited for this job, and we are delighted to see she is well received. This latest change by the Ministry has garnered strong support from the parents of students at Hogwarts. I feel assured that Dumbledore is being evaluated fairly and objectively, said 41-year-old Lucius Malfoy from his estate in Wiltshire. Over the past few years, most of us, including our children, have been quite concerned about Dumbledore's bizarre decisions. Now, it's reassuring to see that the Ministry is also paying attention to these matters. These peculiar decisions mainly manifest in the hiring of controversial staff members, including the werewolf Lupin, the half-giant Hagrid, and the erratic former Auror, Mad-Eye Moody. Of course, Dumbledore, once the greatest wizard of the International Confederation of Wizards and its president, is no longer fit to hold the esteemed position of headmaster of Hogwarts, a Ministry insider revealed yesterday. I think appointing an undersecretary is the first step to ensuring we can feel relaxed about the headmaster's actions at Hogwarts. Senior wizards Griselda Marchbanks and Tiberius Ogden resigned in protest against placing an undersecretary at Hogwarts. Hogwarts is a school, not an outpost of Cornelius Fudge's office, Mrs. Marchbanks said. This is a vile attempt to show a lack of trust in Dumbledore. For more details about Mrs. Marchbanks, a member of a clownish group involved in subversive activities, please turn to page 17. Hermione finished reading the article and glanced across the table at the two of them. Now we know why Umbridge is here. Cornelius Fudge is forcing her to oversee us through educational decrees. And now he's giving her the authority to inspect and evaluate other teachers. Hermione's breathing was a bit rapid, and her eyes were bright. It's unbelievable. It's unbearable. Indeed, Harry said, looking down at his right hand, which was gripping the edge of the table. He stared at the faint scars left on his skin after Umbridge had punished him by making him write lines. But a grin spread across Ron's face. "What?" Hermione and Harry stared at him and said. "Oh, I just can't wait to see Professor McGonagall being inspected," Ron said happily. "Umbridge has no idea what she's in for." "Great, hurry up," Hermione said, jumping up from her chair. "We'd better go and catch up before Umbridge inspects Bin's class." But Professor Umbridge didn't inspect their history of magic class, a boring lesson on Mondays, nor did she show up in Snape's dungeon during his class. There, Harry saw his Moonstone essay, marked with a messy black D scrawled in one corner like a nail. "I will grade you as I would for your exams," Snape sneered, his gaze sweeping over them as he collected the assignments. "You should have realistic expectations for the exams." Snape walked to the front of the classroom, turned, and faced them. "The standard of your homework is appalling. Most of you will fail. This is your exam. I think this will have a huge impact on the reports on the diversity of antidotes for poisons. Perhaps I should start putting those who got a D in detention," he added with a snigger, just like Malfoy. "Some people got a D. At this, Harry understood, and Hermione, who was also looking at him, tried to see what grade he had received. He quickly stuffed his Moonstone essay into his bag, keeping his sense of self-deception intact and maintaining some privacy. To avoid giving Snape any excuse to fail him in this class, Harry carefully read each instruction on the blackboard at least 3 times before proceeding. His caution didn't make the potion turn the exact shade of green like Hermione's, but at least it wasn't pink like Neville's. When he handed in his potion at the end of the class, he noticed that the disdain in Snape's usual sneer was slightly lessened. As they walked out of the dungeon and climbed the stairs, Hermione said, "Well done, at least it wasn't as bad as last week, right?" They headed towards the Great Hall for lunch. "This homework wasn't too bad, was it?" Hermione continued, though Ron and Harry remained silent. "I mean, of course, I'm not expecting top marks, especially if Snape grades us like it's our N.E.W.T.S, but just passing would be a nice validation of our work, don't you think?" Harry felt a lump in his throat, sensing that a lot of unpredictable things could still happen. "But we have plenty of time to improve," Hermione went on. "This grade is just our baseline, and we can build from here, right?" They sat down at the Gryffindor table. "Obviously, I'd be thrilled if I got an O," Hermione said. "Hermione," Ron interjected sharply, "if you want to know what grade we got, just ask." "I didn't mean, well, if you'd like to tell me," she started. "I got a P," Ron said as he ladled soup into his bowl. "Happy now?" "There's nothing to be ashamed of," Fred and George had joined them. Fred, sitting next to Harry, added, "Getting a P isn't so bad." "But," Hermione questioned, "doesn't P stand for poor, right?" Lee Jordan quipped. "But it's better than a D, isn't it? That stands for dreadful, right?" Harry felt his face heat up and coughed lightly to hide it, though he noticed Hermione was still focused on the topic of wizarding grades. "So, the highest grade, O, stands for outstanding," she said. "And then there's a no, E," George corrected. "E4 exceeds expectations. Fred and I often get E's in various areas, because we always manage to exceed expectations during exams." Everyone except the diligent Hermione burst into laughter. "So after E comes a 4 acceptable," Hermione concluded. "Of course," Fred said carefully, sipping his hot soup. "And if you get a P, it stands for poor," Ron raised his arms, mimicking, "and D for dreadful." "And don't forget T," George reminded them. "T?" Hermione asked, surprised. "Is there something worse than D? What does T stand for?" "Troll," George said quickly. Harry was amused, even though he wasn't sure if George was joking. He imagined hiding from Hermione that he got a T on a test, but he resolved to work harder from now on. Have you been inspected by the High Inquisitor yet? Fred asked. No, Hermione replied instantly. Why? Have you? Just before lunch, George said. Charms class. What did she do? Harry and Hermione asked in unison. Fred shrugged. Not much. Umbridge just sat in a corner, occasionally taking notes. You know what Flitwick's like, he treated her like a guest, and it didn't affect his teaching at all. She only asked Alicia a couple of simple questions about the lesson, and Alicia told her the class was great, which it was, right? I doubt she'll rate old Flitwick too poorly, George said. He always makes sure we all pass our exams. Who's next this afternoon? Fred asked Harry. Trelawney. I foresee a T, he joked. And Umbridge herself. Great, be a good boy for Umbridge. Keep your temper in check, George advised. If you miss more Quidditch practice, Angelina's going to be furious. But Harry didn't have to wait until Defense Against the Dark Arts class to see Professor Umbridge. During a dim divination lesson, just as Harry was pulling out his dream journal, Ron nudged him with his elbow. Harry looked around, bewildered, and saw Professor Umbridge standing in the doorway. The previously cheerful atmosphere in the room vanished instantly, replaced by tense silence. The sudden change disrupted Professor Trelawney's thoughts, as she was muttering over the dream reports handed in by the students. She looked up, scanning the room. Good afternoon, Professor Trelawney, Umbridge said with a smile. I believe you received my note. What time will be convenient for my inspection? Trelawney nodded somewhat reluctantly and quickly turned her attention away from Umbridge, focusing back on the reports. Professor Umbridge continued to smile, pulling a chair close to the front of the class, just inches from Trelawney, and settled in. She took out a clipboard from her floral bag and looked a bit too eager to start the lesson. Professor Trelawney, peering through her overly large glasses, scanned the class and pulled her shawl tighter with trembling hands. Today, we'll continue our study of prophetic dreams, she said, trying to regain her composure, using her usual mysterious, slightly trembling tone. By carefully analyzing recent dreams, we can better understand the prophecies they contain. She stood up and noticed Umbridge seated just to her right. Quickly, she turned to the left, towards Parvati and Lavender, who were discussing one of Parvati's recent dreams. Harry opened his Dream Interpretations report while keeping a discreet eye on Professor Umbridge. She was intently taking notes. After a while, she noticed Trelawney walking around the classroom, occasionally listening to the students' discussions and answering some of their questions. Harry quickly lowered his head and pretended to be reading a book. Quick, think of a dream, he said to Ron. Just in case that annoying woman comes over. It was me last time, Ron protested. This time, it's your turn. Oh, I don't know, Harry said, disappointed. He could hardly remember any dreams he'd had in recent days. If you want me to talk about my dreams, I dreamt that Snape was drowning in my cauldron. All right, let's go with that, Ron said, opening the Dream Oracle with a laugh. Okay, we should add your age and the date in your dream to make it more believable. Should we mention drowning, cauldron, or Snape? Whatever, pick one, Harry said as he glanced back. Professor Umbridge was standing beside Professor Trelawney, taking notes as the divination teacher asked Neville about his dream. You dreamed that again? Ron was completely absorbed in calculating. I don't know, maybe it was last night. You could say that if you like, Harry replied, trying to listen as Professor Umbridge questioned Professor Trelawney. They were only a desk away. Professor Umbridge kept taking notes, while Professor Trelawney looked very annoyed. So far, Umbridge asked, looking up. How long have you been in this position? Can you be more specific? Trelawney frowned, folding her arms tightly across her shoulders, seemingly trying to feel safe in the face of this inspection, which she found insulting. After a slight pause, she decided to answer, but made no effort to hide her strong dislike. She replied angrily, nearly 16 years. Quite a long time, Professor Umbridge said as she wrote in her notebook. Were you appointed by Dumbledore? Of course, Professor Trelawney replied quickly. Professor Umbridge continued to take notes. You are the great seer Cassandra Trelawney's great-great-granddaughter. Yes, Professor Trelawney said, lifting her head. Umbridge continued noting things down. One question, if I'm wrong, please correct me. You're the second in your family to have this gift since Cassandra, right? Umbridge continued. That's not something easily determined. Not every generation has this ability. Roughly every 3 generations, Trelawney answered. Professor Umbridge smiled. I see, she said sweetly, writing something down again. Very well, then. Could you perhaps make a prophecy for me? She looked slightly skeptical, but kept smiling as she asked. Professor Trelawney stiffened, seemingly not believing her ears. I don't understand what you mean, she said, tugging at her shawl with trembling hands and wrapping it tightly around her thin neck. I mean, I'd like you to make a prophecy for me, Professor Umbridge said clearly. By now, not only Harry and Ron were carefully observing and listening to their conversation, but most of the other students had also noticed. At this moment, Professor Trelawney stood up straight, her beads jangling on her wrist, as she indignantly said, this ability is not something ordinary people can witness. Of course, I understand, Professor Umbridge said gently, still taking notes. But stop. Professor Trelawney suddenly exclaimed. She tried to make her tone as soft and mysterious as usual, but her anger disrupted everything. I think I really can foresee something. Something closely related to you. But why do I sense something evil, dark, and even some looming danger of death? Professor Trelawney's slightly trembling finger pointed at Professor Umbridge, who still smiled gently, although her eyebrows raised slightly. I fear, you are now in extreme danger. Professor Trelawney finished her prophecy, pausing for a moment. Umbridge scrutinized Professor Trelawney. All right, she said, still maintaining a gentle demeanor as she scribbled something down. Very well, let's see if that turns out to be true. She turned away. Professor Trelawney continued to stand upright. Harry turned his head to look into Ron's eyes, knowing Ron was thinking the same thing. They both thought Professor Trelawney was an old fraud, but on the other hand, they disliked Umbridge more. So they were on Trelawney's side in this situation. This didn't last long until she suddenly grabbed the report from them. Very well, she said, jabbing her broken finger at Harry's nose in an unusual, but swift manner. Let's take a look at your dream report, she narrated in the tone she used to explain Harry's dream, somewhat muffled, as if she were speaking while eating porridge. But it clearly predicted bad news. He didn't feel much sympathy for her anymore. Professor Umbridge was now standing not far away, taking notes. At this moment, the bell for the end of class rang from the top of the silver ladder. There were 10 minutes left before defense against the dark arts class. When they walked into the noisy classroom, Professor Umbridge was still smiling. Hermione had missed the previous events, because she was attending arithmancy. Harry and Ron took the opportunity to tell her in detail what had happened in divination, while getting out their defensive magical theory star. However, before Hermione could ask any questions, Professor Umbridge interrupted them, demanding silence. Put away your wands, she ordered with a smile, and they, who had been excited to attend defense class, had to put their wands away. Good, we've finished the first chapter. Now turn to page 19, and let's start the second chapter, on basic defensive spells and their origins. Reading doesn't seem to require talking, does it? She smiled smugly as she sat down at her desk. The classroom let out a sigh, and everyone turned to page 19 in their books. Harry even began to doubt whether the book had enough content for them to read through this term. As he flipped through the pages, he noticed Hermione raising her hand again. Professor Umbridge noticed too, but she seemed to have a strategy to prevent unexpected situations. She pretended not to see Hermione until she walked to the front and stood right in front of her. Bending down and speaking quietly so others couldn't hear, she asked, "What is it this time, Miss Granger?" "I've already read Chapter 2, Hermione replied. "Good, then you can move on to Chapter 3. "I've read that as well. In fact, I've finished the entire book." Professor Umbridge blinked, trying to maintain her composure. "Very well, then you should be able to tell me what Slinkhard says about counterjinxes in Chapter 15. "He says counterjinxes is a misleading term," Hermione replied easily. "He argues that counterjinxes are merely a way to make jinxes sound more acceptable." Professor Umbridge raised her eyebrows, and Harry sensed she was surprised, contrary to what she had expected. "But I don't entirely agree with that," Hermione continued. Professor Umbridge's eyebrows shot up higher, and she looked slightly angry. "You don't agree?" she repeated. "Yes, I don't agree," Hermione said. Unlike Umbridge, her voice was clear and caught the attention of the entire class. "Slinkhard says jinxes aren't effective in defense, but they can be very effective." "Oh, you really think so?" Professor Umbridge couldn't control her tone anymore. "Well, I'm afraid that's Slinkhard's opinion, not yours, Miss Granger. These materials are in the classroom for a reason." "But," Hermione started to say, "that's enough." Professor Umbridge snapped, pacing back and forth before standing in front of the class again, with a triumphant expression. "I'm deducting 5 points from Gryffindor, Miss Granger." The class murmured in surprise. "What?" Harry said angrily. "Why? Why?" Hermione asked urgently. "For disrupting the class," Professor Umbridge said calmly. "I'm here to teach you the ministry-approved material, which doesn't include allowing students to voice opinions that don't need to be heard. Your previous teachers may have allowed this, but I am different. Well, except perhaps Professor Quirrell, who at least kept his classes age-appropriate, and his teaching was under the ministry's scrutiny." "Quirrell was a good teacher," Harry said loudly. "He just made one small mistake, being controlled by Voldemort." The entire classroom fell silent. "Then perhaps another week of detention will do you good, Mr. Potter," Professor Umbridge said calmly. Harry's arm was still healing from the last detention, and he knew it would start bleeding again the next evening. During the detention that night, he didn't complain. He was determined not to let Professor Umbridge win. He wrote over and over again, "I must not tell lies." The room was silent except for the scratching of his quill, and each time he wrote, the cut deepened. By the second week of detention, things got worse. As George had predicted, Angelina was even angrier. On Tuesday morning, at the Gryffindor table, Angelina cornered him, so much so that Professor McGonagall had to rush over from the staff table. "Miss Johnson, you can't shout in the Great Hall like this. 5 points from Gryffindor." "But Professor, he can't attend practice again. He's in detention again." "Is that true, Mr. Potter?" Professor McGonagall asked sharply, looking around. "Detention? By whom?" "Professor Umbridge," Harry mumbled, staring at the floor and avoiding her eyes. "Tell me," she said, lowering her voice so that the Ravenclaws behind them couldn't hear. "I warned you last Monday." "How could you lose your temper in her class again?" "Yes," Harry said softly, his head down. "Potter, you must learn to control yourself. You're going to get into trouble." "Another 5 points from Gryffindor." "But why, Professor?" Harry protested, feeling it was unfair. "I've already been punished by her. Why take more points?" Because detention clearly isn't effective for you," Professor McGonagall said angrily. "Now stop complaining, Potter. And as for you, Miss Johnson, you need to control your temper with your Quidditch team members, or you'll lose your captaincy." Professor McGonagall strode back to the staff table. Angelina gave Harry a look of pure disgust and walked off, leaving only Ron next to him, fuming. "She took 5 points from Gryffindor, because I'm getting my arm cut open every night. How is that fair?" "I know, mate," Ron said sympathetically, piling bacon onto his plate. "She just made a snap decision." Hermione, busy reading the Daily Prophet said nothing. "Do you think Professor McGonagall is right?" Harry asked angrily, only to find Hermione was too upset by something in the paper to reply. "She didn't really want to take points from you. I think she was trying to warn you not to lose your temper with Umbridge again," Hermione said, still focused on the newspaper, where Cornelius Fudge seemed to be making some sort of speech on the front page. Harry didn't say anything more as the newspaper caught his attention as well. By the time they walked into Transfiguration, he had forgotten the previous conversation. Professor Umbridge was already sitting in a corner with her clipboard, and the sight reminded Harry of breakfast earlier. As they sat down, Ron muttered under his breath, "Great, let's see what Umbridge is in for now." Professor McGonagall entered the classroom with no sign that she was aware of Umbridge's presence. "All right," she said, pausing briefly, "Mr. Finnegan, come up here and retrieve your homework. Miss Brown, come here and take this box of mice. Don't look so foolish, they won't hurt you. Hand one out to each student." Professor Umbridge pretended to clear her throat a few times, just like when she interrupted Dumbledore's speech before. However, Professor McGonagall completely ignored her. Seamus handed Harry his homework, and Harry was relieved to see he received an A. "All right, everyone, pay attention and listen carefully. Dean Thomas, if you move that mouse again, I'll put you in detention. Most of you have successfully made your snails disappear. Those of you who still have some shells left need to refine your spell work. Today we are going to, Professor Umbridge cleared her throat again. "Who?" Professor McGonagall glanced around with a furrowed brow. "Professor, I would like to know if you have received my note to check on you." "Of course I received it. But now you must adhere to my classroom rules," Professor McGonagall said, turning her back. Professor Umbridge looked as if she had been slapped, but did not say anything. She merely adjusted the parchment on her clipboard and scribbled furiously on it. Professor McGonagall remained extremely indifferent and continued with her lesson. "As I was saying, the disappearing charm becomes more complicated when used on animals. Invertebrates like snails do not offer you enough of a challenge. Mice, being mammals, are a bit more difficult. But that doesn't mean you can practice until dinner. Now let me check your spells so I can see how well you've done." How could she forget about Umbridge while teaching? Harry whispered to Ron with a smile, relieved that McGonagall had eased his anger. Umbridge, unlike in Trelawney's class, did not patrol the room with McGonagall. Perhaps she realized McGonagall would not allow it. Nevertheless, she sat in her little corner, writing more, and when McGonagall told her she could leave, Umbridge's face showed a look of terror. "Well, it started," Ron said as he pinched the mouse's tail and put it back into the box next to Lavender. As they left the classroom, Harry noticed Umbridge was standing very close to the teacher's desk. He gently nudged Ron and then Hermione, and the three of them carefully eavesdropped from the side. "How long have you been teaching at Hogwarts?" Umbridge asked. "Since December it will be 39 years, Professor McGonagall said, abruptly closing her bag and suddenly adding. Umbridge made a note. "Very well," she said. "You will receive the results of the inspection within 10 days. "I will wait anxiously," Professor McGonagall replied in a cold tone, which was unlike her usual demeanor, and walked out the door with big strides. "You three, hurry up," she added, casting a glance at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Harry, not even giving McGonagall a normal smile, certainly didn't receive any response. He was thinking that the next time he saw Umbridge might be the next time he was in detention. But he quickly realized he was wrong. As they crossed the grass to their Care of Magical Creatures class, they found Umbridge standing beside Professor Grubler-Plank, holding her clipboard. "You haven't taught this class before, have you?" Umbridge asked when Harry and the others saw the bowtruckles lying in the wood chips like a bunch of small twigs on the activity table. "Quite right," Professor Grubler-Plank said, placing her hands behind her back and fiddling with a ball at her feet. "I am substituting for Hagrid." Harry shot an uncomfortable glance at Ron and Hermione. Malfoy was also whispering with Crabbe and Goyle. He surely enjoyed the opportunity to spread rumors around. Umbridge lowered her voice. Though Harry could still hear clearly, "I believe the headmaster seems very reluctant to give me information about these matters. Could you tell me why Professor Hagrid isn't coming?" Harry saw Malfoy, with a longing look, inch closer to Umbridge and Professor Grubler-Plank. "Perhaps I can't," Professor Grubler-Plank said with a light laugh. "I don't know much more than you do. I only received an owl from Dumbledore asking if I could cover a few weeks of teaching. I accepted, and that's all I know. So, may I begin the class?" "Yes, please do," Umbridge said, starting to make notes in her notebook. Umbridge seemed to change the direction of the questions between the class and the students, beginning to ask questions about magical creatures. Most students answered well, but Harry asked a lot of what. He now knew that Hagrid hadn't been fired at least. "All right," Umbridge said after finishing a lot of questions with Thomas, returning to Professor Grubler-Plank's side. "How are you finding the role as a temporary staff member, teaching an outdoor class? I'd like you to talk about how you came to discover Hogwarts and how you were asked to teach here." "Oh, yes, Dumbledore is truly outstanding," Professor Grubler-Plank said sincerely. "I'm very happy here. I've received the joy I needed." Looking skeptical, Umbridge made some notes in her notebook and continued, "What do you plan to teach this semester?" Somewhat impertinent, of course, in the absence of Professor Hagrid. "Oh, I'll cover most of the creatures required for the ordinary wizarding level," Professor Grubler-Plank said. "But we don't have much left to learn. They've already covered unicorns and nifflers. We'll also learn about Porlocks and Neasels, and if possible, Croops and Gnarls, you know." "Very good. You seem to have a clear idea of what you're teaching," Umbridge said, making a conspicuous mark in her notebook. Harry really disliked how she emphasized the word "you," but he disliked even more the question she asked Goyle next. "Now, I've heard you were attacked during class." A dirty grin appeared on Goyle's face, and Malfoy quickly answered for him. "That was me," he said. "I was attacked by a hippogriff." "A hippogriff?" Professor Umbridge seemed confused as she wrote it down. "Only because he didn't follow what Hagrid taught him to do," Harry said angrily, with Ron and Hermione showing their disapproval as well. Professor Umbridge slowly turned her face directly toward Harry. "Another evening of detention, I think," she said softly. "Well, thank you very much, Professor Grubler-Plank. I believe I've asked all the necessary questions. You'll receive the inspection results within 10 days. "Very well," said Professor Grubler-Plank as Umbridge stepped across the lawn and returned to the castle. That night, Harry left Umbridge's office close to midnight again, his wounds worse than before, with the bandages around them soaked in blood. He thought the common room would be empty when he returned, but Ron and Hermione were still there, waiting for him. Harry was very pleased, especially since Hermione's sympathy outweighed any criticism. "Here," she said nervously, placing a small bottle of yellow liquid in front of him. "Put your hand in it, it can heal your wounds. It's Murtlap essence. You really need it." Harry exposed his wound, dipped his hand into the bottle, and felt the pain subside almost instantly. Crookshanks circled his legs, purring, then jumped onto his lap before running off. Thanks, he said gratefully, using his left hand to pet Crookshank's ears. I still think you should report her, Ron said quietly. No, Harry said weakly. McGonagall would go crazy if she found out. Well, maybe she would, Harry said unclearly. But Umbridge has issued a rule that anyone who complains will be fired immediately. Ron opened his mouth, but didn't say anything, closing it after a moment, looking helpless. She's a horrible woman, Hermione whispered, absolutely awful. You know, when you came in, I was just telling Ron that we should do something about her. I suggest poison, Ron said cruelly. No, I mean she's a terrible teacher. We haven't learned anything about defense against the dark arts from her, Hermione said. So, what can we do? Ron yawned. It's too late, isn't it? She's already got the job, she's already here, and Fudge is backing her. Well, Hermione said thoughtfully, you know what I've been thinking today? She glanced at Harry, then said, I think, maybe we should take matters into our own hands. What do you mean, take matters into our own hands? Harry asked, still with his hand in the Murtlap essence. Well, teach ourselves how to defend against the dark arts, Hermione said. Don't start, Ron groaned. You want us to do extra work. Can't you see it's only the second week and Harry and I are already buried in homework? But this is more important than homework, Hermione said, and both Harry and Ron stared at her in surprise. I can't think of anything more important than homework, Ron said. Don't be silly, of course there is, Hermione said. Harry noticed that she had the same determined look she had when she founded SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare. This is about preparing ourselves, like Harry said during Umbridge's first lesson. We have to make sure we can protect ourselves. There's not much we can do on our own, Ron said, sounding defeated. I mean, we can find stuff in the library and practice, I guess. No, I agree, we can find things in books and practice them, Hermione said, but we need a teacher, someone who can show us how to use the spells and correct us when we're wrong. What if we asked Lupin? Harry started to suggest. No, we won't ask Lupin, Hermione said. He's too busy with the Order. He barely has time to rest, even on weekends. So, who then? Harry frowned at Hermione. Hermione took a deep breath. Isn't it obvious, she said. We're talking about you, Harry. There was a silence, the only sound the popping of the logs in the fireplace behind Ron. What about me? Harry said. I think you should teach us how to defend against the dark arts, Hermione said. Harry stared at her, then at Ron, expecting some sign that this was another of her unrealistic plans like SPEW, but what surprised him more was that Ron didn't look upset at all. He was frowning as if he was thinking deeply, then he said, It's a good idea. What is? Harry asked. You, Ron said. Teaching us. But, Harry suddenly laughed, sure that they must be joking. I'm not a teacher. I couldn't. Harry, you're the best in our year at defense against the dark arts, Hermione said. Me? Harry said, laughing more. No, I'm not. You beat me in every exam. Actually, I haven't, Hermione said calmly. You outscored me in third year. That was the only year we both took the exam and had a competent teacher. I didn't tell you my results, but you did better. So, what's your point? Harry asked. My point is, Hermione said, that I don't know anyone better qualified to teach us. Ron grinned at Hermione and then turned back to Harry. Let's think about it, he said, mimicking Goyle's expression. First year, you saved the Sorcerer's Stone from you-know-who. That was just luck, Harry said. That doesn't prove anything. Second year, Ron continued, you killed a basilisk and destroyed Riddle. Yeah, but Fawkes helped me. Third year, Ron said louder, You fought off hundreds of Dementors. You know that was a fluke. If it hadn't been for the time turner, last year, Ron was nearly shouting, you fought you-know-who again and got away. Look. Harry said angrily. Because Ron and Hermione were grinning with satisfaction, Harry said, just listen to me for a moment, okay? It sounds like that, but all the factors are luck. I did nothing half the time. I didn't plan anything. I didn't even think about it. I just happened to get help every time. Ron and Hermione were still laughing, which only made Harry angrier, though he didn't even understand why he was so upset. Stop just sitting there laughing. You know you could do better than I did, he said angrily. I don't even know what happened. I just happened to be there. It's not like I'm an expert in defense against the dark arts. I just happened to stumble into it. Stop laughing. The jar of Murtlap essence fell to the ground and shattered. Even though he knew the jar would hit his foot, he didn't get up. Crookshanks immediately hid under the sofa, and Ron and Hermione's laughter finally ceased. You don't know what it was like. Harry shouted. You've never faced him, have you? You think it's the same as using magic in class. The whole time, you can't do anything except die, whether you have brains or courage or anything else, because you'll be killed or tortured in a billionth of a second, or watch your friends die. They never taught us what to do in such situations in class. You two sit here and act like you're watching me as some smart little kid who's still alive, while others like Diggory are just dirty things. You don't understand, but I do. Voldemort didn't kill me just because he doesn't want to yet. We didn't say that, mate, Ron said, looking frightened. We didn't go with Diggory, we wouldn't. We just might have had a worse outcome. He looked at Hermione with a pleading expression, who had a face full of helplessness. Harry, she said timidly, don't you see? This is why we need you. We need someone who can really face him, face Voldemort. It was the first time she had said Voldemort's name, and it calmed Harry down. Even though he was still breathing heavily, he sank into a chair, his hands trembling. He wished the jar of Murtlap essence hadn't broken. Well, think about it, Hermione said calmly, please. Harry couldn't think of anything to say. He felt ashamed of his outburst earlier, and nodded slowly to show his agreement. Hermione got up. All right. I'm going to bed then, she said clearly as usual. Good night. Ron also started to move. Leaving, he said awkwardly to Harry. Okay, Harry said. Wait a minute. I need to clean this up. He pointed to the shards on the floor. Ron nodded and left. Reparo. Harry muttered, pointing his wand at the porcelain shards on the floor. They rejoined, good as new, but the Murtlap essence couldn't be repaired. He suddenly felt so tired that he wanted to collapse into the chair and sleep, but he forced himself to follow Ron upstairs. That night was exhausting, and he had a dream about a long corridor and a locked door. When he woke up the next morning, his scar began to hurt. This is purely my personal opinion, but it's a very good piece of work. So I made this video for everyone. I appreciate you watching it. If you liked it, please support this series. Your views are my motivation. Don't be stingy. Remember to subscribe to this channel and click the little bell next to it, and give me a thumbs up.